Good morning, everyone. This is Vicki. I'm helping Alexis. She is our research assistant here at NICWA, and she's going to be walking you through our community asset mapping that you all tuned in for.
Thanks, Vicki. Good morning, everyone. My name is Alexis Contreras. I'm a member of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Round here in Oregon. So actually, good morning to those of us on the West Coast, and then good afternoon to everyone else. Today we're talking, our webinar is on creating a movement through community asset mapping. And so we're going to talk about asset mapping, a little bit about what we've been doing here at NICWA and with some of our partners, and kind of talk about the process and some methods and tools, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end for some questions. So we'll just go ahead and jump right in. Please go ahead and feel welcome to put questions in the chat box. We might not get to them till the end of the presentation, but we will try to leave some time for those at the end. So what is an asset in your community? So this is just a question that I'm asking the group of us that are on this webinar today, just to think about some of the assets of your community, or what are some of the strengths or resources and things that you have that really help to bring well-being to Native youth and families. I'm just asking this question just for you to think about it on your own, or if you're with a group of people, you can maybe discuss it among yourselves. But just to frame our conversation today, I just wanted to ask that and kind of get people thinking about their own communities. So community asset mapping. Some of our learning objectives for today, here we're going to gathering information. So let me just start with what is community asset mapping. And so community asset mapping is really an activity that local community organizers first conduct when they are starting to focus their advocacy around a specific issue in their community. I think let's see, it looks like it advanced on itself, so I'm going to put it back to this one. So community asset mapping is really, it uses a strengths-based approach. A lot of communities, instead of focusing on deficits, community asset mapping really focuses on what are the strengths and the assets within the community. Those assets are defined by the community and identified by community members. It really emphasizes the positive ability of communities to develop problem-solving approaches based on their strengths of their community members and their institutions and different structures. And then it's a very broad, it takes a lot of community participation. It's an exercise that encourages that. So everyone and anyone can be involved. It can be a process that's led by tribal leaders to youth. Here at NICWA, we worked with our First Kids First partners to work with a tribe here in Oregon, the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. We worked with their Youth Leadership Council on a community asset mapping process that they led themselves. They did have the assistance of the Child Welfare or the Child and Family Services Director as someone who was helping them to coordinate and kind of convene that group, but they really were the youth were the leaders of the group. They led the process, they led the direction, and they did the collection and analysis on their own with some assistance from us. So I'm going to go on to the next slide here, which is the historical background. And really what we wanted to say about this in this slide, in this picture, you see this visual image that's from Paula Greasy, who was using Geographic Information System software, or GIS software, in the 90s to map native cultural knowledge for conservation and ecological purposes. And she used the mapping to show how cultures are reflected in places. So we really wanted to use mapping as, many of our creation or origin stories are tied back to our land and our land base. Even if they weren't a visual, they were oral. We had oral traditions and had kind of oral maps of our culture, our history, and our tradition. And so it's really kind of using mapping to kind of decolonize mapping and kind of reclaim it in our own, within an indigenous framework. So because of the historical and intergenerational trauma faced by Native communities, there may have been times when our stories or our knowledge was ignored by mainstream people, by the government systems. So really, instead of focusing on assets, a lot of that energy was focused on, was spent on addressing historical and intergenerational traumas. So like the disruption of tribal governing and leadership structures, the removal to different lands and traditional economies, removal of children into boarding schools, and then later into foster care and adoption. So maps were used in a way by policymakers to explain the limits on tribal jurisdiction and inequities in funding. And so again, we really want to use this community asset mapping as a way to kind of reclaim that mapping and use it in a way that works for our communities. So community asset mapping pairs this ancestral and collective knowledge to empower communities to use their assets for ongoing well-being of their community and, like I said before, reclaim and decolonize mapping. So the ability to use and organize the community's assets in ways that improve the well-being of the community is based, and its basis is for the asset-based sustainable development strategy. So this is the First Nations Development Institute developed several strategies that can be used to promote asset-based development. So you see them here on this slide. So the ability to control, retain, increase, utilize, leverage, and create assets. And you can see the definitions here: control, to increase the control of an asset through a variety of means, to create or establish internal controls or regulatory structures within the community, to retain assets, to expand or add value to existing assets, to build or strengthen the ability of the community to manage and make use of assets, to leverage or attract, to generate additional resources to the asset pool, and then to also create or bring new assets to the community. And so this is just an image that kind of just, when we talk about community development, you have to kind of, asset mapping is kind of a map of what you have today. It really helps with your visioning and with your development of how you want to connect resources and build on those resources. So what can community asset mapping be used for? Tribal governance. So this picture that you see here is of some of, these are not current, but NCI Youth Commission members, former NCI Youth Commission members. But tribal leaders can use community asset mapping to help build momentum in the community to address issues that impact Native youth well-being, and to include more community knowledge into the governing structure. So tribal leaders really need to be aware of all the assets in their communities so that they can strengthen their governance systems. When community members gather data on tribal assets, they can be resources that current and future tribal leaders use for education, for training, for technical assistance on different community issues. The methods used could also highlight opportunities for tribal leaders to collaborate with other community leaders to create new policy solutions. So some of those things might be creating a policy research agenda. It might be a public and media campaign, or a training tool on different Native youth issues for tribal leaders. So tribal child welfare is another system that would benefit from community asset mapping to focus on the safety and well-being of children, youth, and families. So when tribal child welfare can be funded by the tribe, by government agreements, but it really benefits from having broad community participation. So community asset mapping in this case could help by maybe creating a physical map of all the tribal foster homes. It could allow tribal leaders to analyze the distance of tribal foster homes to services and to extended family members. It could identify community members who can offer parenting workshops that highlight cultural and traditional practices. They could also use methods that could identify families who would be willing to be tribal foster homes. So knowing what assets are within the community can assist tribal child welfare in creating resource lists for families, so that those could include housing, employment, childcare, healthcare, education, cultural centers, activities, community gatherings, substance treatment, and many more. And it can also be used for tribal health systems. The image you see in the slide is of from the Confederated Tribes of Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians. And they're also a tribe that's federally recognized here in Oregon, where Vicki and I are at the moment. And they can use it also in a variety of ways. There's many assets in tribal communities that tie directly back to the health of the community members. So many of the healthcare assets include physical places like hospitals and clinics. But tribal health systems are also greatly affected by what goes on within the home and within the community. So health outcomes are tied to the availability of physical assets too, like parks, gyms, community gardens, just other assets that promote physical health. It could be something like access to traditional foods and herbs and plants that are assets to health in the community. And then examples of other people could include doctors, clinic staff, public health workers, traditional healers, and really anyone who is promoting healthy behaviors in the community. So, so really a beneficial way for tribal health systems to use this data from mapping is to point people in the right direction for specific health services that are offered within their community. And also tribal education systems. So Tribes and Native communities continue to develop and frame education systems that reflect the community's needs and educate students consistent with their cultural values and beliefs. And so community asset mapping can assist tribal communities in really developing tribally led, culturally based curriculum. Assets can be identified using and used to restructure teaching methods to maybe include elders or traditional healers and community members, and include base curriculum or base the curriculum in land-based and cultural knowledge. And tribes can work with their local school districts to develop an education plan that meets the requirements for Title VI, and present the results of their community asset mapping process that could be used as inputs to plan and could frame discussions about development of education programs in the local school districts that meet the needs of Native students. So the framework that we use at NICWA with our community development work, and also the framework that's used for this community asset mapping tool, is the Relational Worldview model. We use this model to adapt the community asset mapping tools for use in tribal communities. The Relational Worldview model provides an indigenous context for well-being, based on kind of traditional teachings and from many different indigenous communities. So the relational worldview model highlights how individual, family, and community well-being occurs when balance and harmony exist among many aspects in life. And you see these as the 4 quadrants that are in this image right here. And it really encourages us to look beyond kind of the Western linear framework and kind of look at all of our community assets on a pretty broad scope. So just to talk a little bit about our framework that we use, the Relational Worldview model. In this, you'll see this as the individual or family level. When we look at it on our individual or family level, we have the context, the mental, the body, and the spirit, and those 4 quadrants make up that model. In the context, we're looking at our social history, economics, our family, our culture. In the mental quadrant, these are our thinking processes, our self-esteem, our memories, our emotions. In the body quadrant, these are our genetics, this is our health status, our sleep and rest. And in the spirit quadrant, we have innate positive, learn positive, innate negative, learn negative. Those are, so innate positive could be things like good spirits, or some may think of it as good luck. Learn positive would be more like our ceremonies that we learn. This is where religion would fit in. Innate negative could be bad spirits or bad luck. Learned negative be those kind of learned, like bad medicine, some might call it. And then when we look at it at the organizational or the community level, the context quadrant becomes the environment, the mental quadrant becomes infrastructure, the body becomes resources, and the spirit becomes mission. And so in that environment quadrant, this is where we kind of see the social environment of a community or organization, the political environment, the economic environment. For infrastructure, here's where you see your policies and procedures, your strategic plans, your service design. And then in the resources, you do have, of course, things like funding and those dollars, but also we really like to think of this here as people. So who are those champions that are out there working for the well-being of Native youth and families? Are there coalitions in the community that are working for that purpose. And then in the spirit quadrant, that becomes the mission. And so what are the values of the community or the organization? What is the mission and vision? What is the purpose? And so community asset mapping, when we're first starting out the planning process, you really want to identify and involve partners. So like I mentioned before, it can be anywhere from tribal leaders to youth who are involved and maybe who are driving the process, but you're going to have more than just people who are involved with kind of the process, but people who are also involved by maybe providing an interview or telling a story, and then defining the community boundaries. Those can look very different for different communities. Some tribes may define it as the reservation. Some may define, have an urban area that a lot of their members reside in and include that in their boundaries. So it's really up to the community again. And then defining what is an asset in the community. That's also led by the community to determine what assets to include. And then determining the collection methods and tools, which we'll talk about a little bit in just a few minutes. We'll talk more about some of those methods and tools that can be used. And then however you want to organize your assets on a map, or however you want to share those results so that you can record them somehow. So one example that we'd like to share is with the 8 Northern Indian Pueblos, who did a community asset mapping project as it was actually a requirement from one of the grants that they were receiving. They did this in coordination with the Relational Foundation, and they really looked at the success of the Navajo Nation's early, their home visiting program, and really wanted to bring that program to the northern Pueblos. But they also had to think about, well, wait, we see the success at Navajo Nation, but is this really something that our communities need? Is this something that our communities are needing? And so they formed the Pueblo Outreach Project, which was a process they did community asset mapping and education around early childhood programs. So the services, they identified the assets, gaps, and family support services within each of the Pueblos, and they really were trying to understand how home visiting could be a resource for their communities. Along the way, they definitely wanted this to be an educational process, so they were really educating families in early childhood development. And then the last one says to produce a coordinated support plan based on the results to support healthy, strong children and families. So, before you begin collecting information and mapping out your community's assets, you should approach tribal government and tribal leaders with your idea and ask for permission to do community asset mapping. So we, when we were working with the Umatilla Youth Leadership Council, they actually went to their tribal council to get to present the idea and get their backing, because you really have to think about who are those change leaders, who are those stakeholders who have some say in the matter, and you really want them to be supportive in this process, so that you can so that you have that support from them and that blessing from them. So it's also just your tribal governments have their own sovereign and interest in their community. That's their job, is to work for you. So you really want to have their support from them. And then so community members, youth organizations, leaders, these are just some examples of different people that you might be reaching out to and involving in this process. So you would want to really kind of organize the community members and organizations and leaders that really care about the enhancing well-being of Native youth. And that can be really diverse in the people and the members of your community that want to be a part of this process. So with 8 Northern Pueblos, they were working with the Relational Foundation, and they got some funding from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. They were also working with another of their partners was the University of New Mexico Center for Education Policy Research. So they really did get a lot of support with their community asset mapping process. They got some support in just kind of facilitating the process. I think it was helpful being that they were 8 separate communities, 8 Northern Indian Pueblos. So they organized meetings with all of the tribal governors and councils to introduce the project and intended outcomes. They had advisory committee members to be a point of contact for the Relational Foundation that could provide input and promote community participation. And then they hosted regular meetings to introduce the project to different programs that they had in the community. So defining community boundaries. Again, you're working with your community members to define the tribal community's boundaries. So it could be geographic boundaries, so it could be the reservation, it could be a town, it could be a city, but it doesn't have to be. It could be rivers or mountains or landmarks that you decide. So you might also want to consider physical boundaries when you're doing your mapping or setting your boundaries. But asset mapping can really help break down those education borders that were created by outside entities or title programs. So for example, in Oklahoma, they are set up by, they have like a grid system that dictates their boundaries for spending, but several of the tribes are spread out over several of these quadrants in their system. So thinking about that and being mindful about that also may be something that you need to think about when creating boundaries. Something that you could use it for would be canoe journey. This is just an example from, we're here in the Northwest, and so canoe journey is a big part of the culture here in the Northwest. And so if you wanted to do an asset mapping exercise around canoe journey and identifying all the resources for canoe journey, and then maybe if you're creating your boundaries, that could maybe be the route that's taken on the water, or it could be all the tribal communities that you plan to visit. So defining a community asset. So here, again, you see the relational worldview model. On the individual and family assets, some of those in the context quadrant are support and interdependence, connection to land, community involvement, participation, kinship, elders, ties to the community. In the mental quadrant, you have cultural identity. This is where sense of belonging and to your cultural group is, ethnic pride, self-esteem, happiness, determination. In the body quadrant, this is financial security here, stability, income, adequate food, good nutrition, traditional foods, and housing are all in this body quadrant. And then in the spirit, we have spiritual value and well-being, spiritual practice, and knowledge of ceremonies, and expressing Native identity. So these are all some examples, or kind of helping to define what a community asset may look like in these different quadrants. So again, using that canoe journey example, in the context, we have our connections to the water, and it's an intertribal, intergenerational event where like anyone from the community could be involved with it. And then in the mental quadrant, we have this cultural identity, your sense of belonging to your tribe and to your canoe family, and also kind of those lessons that you learned from participating. In the body quadrant, you may be eating traditional foods on journey. You're definitely using your physical self to paddle through the water on a canoe. And then in the spirit quadrant, you're practicing your cultural knowledge, and there's really that connection, I think, to ancestry and family. So on the organizational or community level, in the environment quadrant, you see things like physical, so parks, monuments, tribal lands, economics, so banks, financial institutions, culture, and then in infrastructure, these are, again, policies and procedures, your management structures, the service design, tribal codes are in this part, here. And then on the resources, human beings, again, so this is, and just some are listed, artists, musicians, athletes, activists, tribal leadership. So those, again, are champions, are leaders of a cause. And advocacy groups could be in here, tribal media. And then in the mission quadrant, mandates, organizational spirit, values, purpose, and kind of our philosophies that we use. So for our different collection methods and tools, so some of these, could be surveys, interviews, community meetings, community walks, World Café, bingo, and we'll talk about a few of those just in a minute. And then tools, mapping, so it could be street mapping. This could be online. We've gotten some training from Google on My Maps. They really help us to kind of see how My Maps could be used in different communities. And I'll show you an example in a minute as well. So for 8 Northern Pueblos, what they did was they sent out a needs assessment to kind of evaluation questions to community leaders. They developed community planning teams that provided feedback. And then they had regular ongoing planning team meetings. And then they began to building their capacity map. So they have come up with a really beautiful report that they got some really nice graphic designing on. and unfortunately they're not sharing it because it has sensitive information that's just for their community members only. But they really did a nice job of coming up with something that was really readable and user-friendly in the end for their membership that they wanted to share their report with. So an example of a structured one way or one method to gain that and gain information about assets would be structured or unstructured interviews. So as part of the interview process, when you're working on community asset mapping, it's important to let people know what the purpose of community asset mapping is and how the information that's collected is going to be used. And then you can do this either on an individual level, you could do it on a group level, such as focus groups. And then either way, in a structured or unstructured way. If it's structured, you want to have a list of specific questions already drafted that you want to ask to get to know about more specific assets. And then you want your questions to be open-ended to really allow for descriptive answers and to allow the interviewee to talk freely. And then for an unstructured interview, the interviewer can introduce the idea of community asset mapping and the community assets that are being mapped, and then there just can be some discussion around that with the individual or with a group. But definitely in both a structured or unstructured interview, you'd want to take notes so that the information can be gathered and then put onto whatever community asset mapping tool you choose to use. And just to go back to this picture is of Dolores Quintero. She's a Miwok member, and she actually this picture came from a YouTube video where Dolores was talking about some of their traditional medicines. And so this is just one way to kind of record assets in your community was by doing this interview. So they actually interviewed her, and she talked about different medicines, how they use them, how, and then she also talked about the importance of this next generation or our youth really getting to learn those lessons that she got to learn as a youth. And then community walks. These can be a great method to gather community assets. So you can walk through a community and know information about the community's resources and environment on a map. And then, so in this picture, it's the Fond du Lac Tribal and Community College. So they did a community walk with their language program. So they had they were able to kind of take pictures and videos of local assets, but it was also in their language as well. World Café is another method. This method is a really flexible format. You can use it kind of with a large or small groups and have your different questions that you want to ask to get at different assets in the community at different tables, and then people can, you start in smaller groups, and so those smaller groups can discuss each topic at their group, and then everyone switches, and then you can those groups can also build on what was already mentioned and add their own ideas to each one. So you want to also be recording all this information. You can use butcher paper, bright, nice colored markers, and this really works well for large or small groups. The National Indian Education Association actually used this technique with a really large group I think they had like 100 people in the room, and they were asking about, in the next 50 years, what do we want our Native education systems to look like? They asked what should be the 3 main priorities of NIEA as we move into the next 50 years, and then what resources, tools, et cetera, will education systems need to create this future for our students. So they were asking those 3 questions. They did the World Café format to use that. So that's just one example. And then bingo. So bingo is a fun activity that can bring community members together in one place. So organizing a bingo night can be a great forum to collect community-based data. And we've used this activity at NICWA. It was kind of created by our founder and senior advisor, Terry Cross. They were working on a project with PSU at the time, and they wanted to collect data on what cultural activities a youth would be participating in if they were seen as a successful Native youth, whatever that means to those communities or to the Portland Native community. So this was done with the Native American Youth and Family Center, and so every other Sunday they host a potluck for a group of elders, and it's a time for them to kind of enjoy a meal together, socialize, and then play bingo. And so the researchers were asking if they could collect data during this time, during this potluck, because they knew all the elders would be there for that. And so the response that they got was, sure, you can come and talk to us, but you can't interrupt bingo. So Terry said, I can work with that. So he came up with a way to collect the data and also play bingo at the same time. So what they did was they had number slips for the bingo numbers, and then people answered the question of, what were the cultural activities that would be seen from a youth that a youth would be participating in. And so the participants of the bingo wrote down on those numbers their responses, and then the numbers were all collected, and those were the bingo numbers used to call out. So when the bingo caller was calling the numbers, they also read off the activity, the cultural activity that was written down on the paper. And then, of course, there was prizes, because it's bingo, so we got to have prizes. But some of the things that were listed in that particular bingo session were learning about family structure and traditions, tanning buckskin, gathering, picking berries, root digging, fishing, drumming, singing, and learning tribal history. So that's how bingo as a data collection method started, and so it's also a fun way, really fun way that people really enjoy to collect data. And so presenting the results, just being mindful about who are you presenting to, who are those change makers that you want to present this around. So if it's tribal council, if it's general council, if it's different community presentations, and then how do you want to share that? Is it in a report that's visual? Is it in a narrative? And then would there be a digital database with all these assets that you've collected, or a reference guide? So just kind of thinking about, this could also be a number of different things, but just thinking about how you want to present the data and to whom. So this is a community example. So it's and I'm really apologize if I'm pronouncing this wrong, but the Holquinum Coast Salish of Cooper Island and Vancouver Island did this mapping project. So they had Google Maps or Google My Maps come out and train them on how to use this model. And it was the Two Houses Half Buried in Sand digital map, and it really aimed to revive the legacy of Burl criers. And it documented stories and the culture of their people who are living on the east coast of Vancouver Island. And so it's really a visual, it's interactive, it locates the stories and the waterways, and so you see the little icons and you can click on them. You can have them be linked to videos. So like in the interview example where the woman was talking about their traditional medicines and how they're used. So if you want them to be, there's an area where people are gathering different medicines, that could be linked. You could put an icon there and link it to a video talking about those medicines. There's also ways to make it private. So you could share it. It could be password protected. So if you didn't want it just available to the general public, but just to your tribal members or to just those who you choose to share the information, it could be set to, there's different privacy settings that can be set. But it's a great way also to have this visual, interactive kind of way to record the information that you've gathered. So community asset mapping, this is just an image that kind of shows the circle of how things go, the identifying the issue and involving partners, planning the community asset mapping process, implementation and methods of tools, analysis and presentation, and then community development. So again, we like to see this as it's kind of not like a linear view, but things might change along the way, and that's fine. But this is just the image showing kind of that community asset mapping. And so with 8 Northern Pueblos, again, just to show you, they had the Lano Foundation kind of stay on as a TA provider for them, and they've had some assistance with research to identify funding sources to really kind of implement, they have done their planning side of things, and they have finished their community asset mapping, but kind of what they want to do next with that information. They really do have the Lano Foundation as a partner in the future. So that's another thing to think about, is like just the partnerships that are made through community asset mapping. And then we have a list of references here, how the toolkit was developed that we produced. And we do have some time. We have about 10 minutes, I think, if there's some questions. But that's the end of our slide presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has. So I'll just give everybody a few minutes to kind of type your questions in that chat box, and I'm happy to answer some. My email address is up on the screen as well, alexis@niqua.org. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have by email as well. Well, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today on this webinar on community asset mapping. I'm still happy to answer any questions that you may have, but by email or online if they come in. But I think if there's no more questions at this time, we can go ahead and wrap up for the day, and you guys can get like 5 minutes back into your like 7 minutes or 8 minutes back into your day.
Have a great weekend, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. And we have another webinar next Tuesday. It's on substance abuse and keeping families together, doing a family treatment model. So we would love to have you on board.